Our first class of molecules that we're going to discuss is carbohydrates. What do you think of when you think of the word carbohydrate? You normally think of sugar. We sometimes call sugars saccharides. As a matter of fact, the first artificial sweetener was called saccharin. So we're talking about sugars. Actually, there are two functions of carbohydrates, and we normally think of carbohydrates as those that give us energy. Because that's where we get our dietary carbohydrates. But there is another group of carbohydrates that are not for energy, and we'll talk about those at the end of our discussion of carbohydrates. Those are actually carbohydrates that play a role in the structure of some organisms. They're actually a building material, and they're not broken down for energy or nutrition. They actually play a part in the structure of organisms. So let's talk about exactly what a carbohydrate is. Okay, carbohydrates are molecules that contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a ratio always 1 to 2 to 1. And what I mean by that is there's always going to be twice as many hydrogen atoms as there are carbon or oxygen atoms. A great example of that would be our glucose or fructose that we looked at earlier, which is C6H12O6. Notice that there are twice as many hydrogen. There's 12 hydrogens, and there's only 6 carbon and 6 oxygen. So it's always 1 to 2 to 1. This can vary a little when you get into the large carbohydrates that have many atoms. You may be off an atom or two. The ratio may not be exactly 1 to 2 to 1, but it's always going to be something very close to that. Our monomer for carbohydrates is called a monosaccharide. This is literally one sugar. These are our simplest sugars. And keep in mind, these simple sugars can actually be used themselves for energy. We can use these simple sugars for energy, or these very simple sugars can be bonded together and stored. You can bond lots of these together and store it as a polymer, store it for energy. Okay? So, a monosaccharide, how do you identify what is exactly a monosaccharide? When you're looking at the molecular formula for a carbohydrate, a monosaccharide will always have somewhere between 3 and 7 carbon atoms. So our example of glucose or fructose, C6H12O6, would definitely be a monosaccharide. Examples again, glucose, fructose have 6 carbons. Ribose, a sugar that we're going to talk about when we talk about nucleic acids and RNA, has 5 carbons. 5 carbon sugars are called pentose sugars. Penta means 5. Deoxyribose, which is also a 5 carbon sugar, is found in DNA. Okay, so these are monosaccharides. And if you take a look at my illustration here, you'll see this is the linear illustration of here is fructose right there, and here is glucose. We saw those just a few moments ago, but these have 6 carbons. Our ribose has 5 there. Okay, monosaccharide structures are often illustrated like this in a linear form. But please realize, just for future illustration, that when these structures are in aqueous solutions, that they form rings. So these carbons will come around and bond to the other carbon. So when you have a 6 carbon sugar, it's going to look like this when it's in a ring form. It looks like a hexagon. And the only reason I tell you that is because when we show illustrations of polymers of monosaccharides, when we show lots and lots of these glucoses bonded together, sometimes we just show them as hexagons lined up next to each other, indicating that they have bonded together. Just didn't want you to get confused. When we can actually take these monosaccharides and bond them together and store them, or make additional different molecules out of them. We find them in nature oftentimes together. And when 2 monosaccharides are bonded together, it's called a disaccharide. Di means 2. And again, the reaction that would occur that would bond two monosaccharides together is dehydration synthesis or condensation synthesis. So examples of disaccharides, some that you may recognize, some you may not. Maltose is two glucoses bonded together. This is a sugar that's found in the digestive tract. Sucrose is a glucose and a fructose bonded together. This is found in plants. And one that you may be very familiar with is lactose, which is milk sugar. This is a galactose, which is a monosaccharide bonded with a glucose. So each one of these disaccharides is two monosaccharides bonded together. When we have lots of monosaccharides bonded together, we call it a polysaccharide. Poly means many. So this would be lots of monosaccharides bonded together. We see two kinds of these. There is one kind that we're going to talk about first that is for storage of energy. So these would be monosaccharides bonded together to be broken down later when the energy needed to be used. We also have a couple of these that are for structural purposes in organisms, as we mentioned earlier. But let's take the first group first. Let's talk about those polysaccharides that are for the storage of energy. Okay, the first one is called starch. You may have heard of this before. These are polymers of glucose monomers that are found in plants. So this is how plants store their extra energy. We're going to learn in Chapter 7 that plants actually perform photosynthesis, which is the capturing of solar energy and storing it in the molecule of a sugar. And these plants actually take these individual monosaccharide sugar molecules and bond them together to store for later use, and that's what we call starch. Animals also have a short-term storage of energy called glycogen. Animals actually take individual glucose molecules and bond them together as a polymer, store them in their livers. Okay, you bond glucose and store it in your liver, and this is to help maintain your blood sugar. If your blood sugar dips for some reason, then your liver would take this glycogen, break it down, and release it as glucose into your bloodstream to help keep your blood sugar normal. Let's talk about the second group of these, this right here, the structural polysaccharides. The first one is cellulose. Cellulose is a very complex molecule. It is a polymer of glucose, but it's bonded together so that the bonds are very difficult to break. Cellulose actually is the primary component of the cell wall of plant cells. So when you eat plant cells, when you eat a plant, you actually can obtain nutrients and energy from all parts of the plant cell except the cell wall. This cellulose that makes up the cell walls of plant cells actually goes through your digestive system totally undigested. It's very important in our diet. Again, it's hard to break down. It's hard to digest. We call this fiber. As a matter of fact, herbivores such as sheep, cows, etc., they have to depend on a bacteria that's found in their gut to actually break this molecule down. It's very difficult to digest. So examples of what exactly is cellulose in the world around us. We make paper out of cellulose. It's cotton. It's wood. So these things are difficult to break down. Second structural polysaccharide is called chitin. Chitin, again, is a polymer of glucose bonded together with very, very strong bonds, difficult to break down. This substance makes up the exoskeleton of arthropods, things like insects and shrimp, crabs, even roly-polies. Also, fungal cells. The cells that make up a fungus actually have cell walls around them that are made of chitin.